Hello everyone, this is Rami reporting for Reason to Resist here in Bogotá. Today is the 25th of January 2026. This is the last day of the Nuestra America conference, a two-day conference that was called by Progressive International as well with the Colombian government of President Petro as a call to basically build a united response across Latin America against Trump's imperialist ambitions in the Western Hemisphere. It started with the U.S. invasion of Venezuela, as well with the brutal kidnapping of President Maduro. But then Trump reiterated calls that maybe Colombia would be next. And then, of course, America has always been wanting to tear down the great Cuban Revolution, right? And remove President Diaz-Canel from power. So the purpose of this Nuestra America conference was to build a united response in order to push back against Donald Trump, against the West and their imperialist mission in the Western Hemisphere. And the the call has been really centered around this American policy called the Monroe Doctrine, which has been escalated over recent months, especially with Donald Trump's 2026 security guidance, which basically is calling for reinforced measures to be implemented here in the Western Hemisphere. And I spoke with delegates from Panama, Cuba, Colombia, and pretty much Mexico and all across the Western Hemisphere. And the sentiment is all the same. We need to resist against any call by the United States to get involved in the Latin America. The end of the Monroe Doctrine, the end of the Monroe Doctrine, the end of Latin America being considered as United States' backyard. So tune in as we speak to members of Latin American civil society, political parties, as they tell us what has been going on at this Nuestra America conference and what can we expect in terms of tangible steps to push back against American imperialism. So there was a call that was set up around a week or two ago that I received about this conference called Nuestra America. It's an emergency session. It seems that it was called as a response of the U.S. kidnapping of Maduro and the total breach of Venezuelan sovereignty. Why did you answer this call today or to attend this conference today?
I think the starting point for any conversation about what's happening in Latin America and the world more broadly has to begin with an honest assessment of U.S. imperialism today. And U.S. imperialism today, with the current occupant of the White House, is a far more vulgar, aggressive form. Imperialism has been the constant threat, the primary contradiction here in Latin America for a long time. But I think now we can really see, as clearly as we have in recent history, that the threat is very real. And I think, frankly, the war on Latin America and the Caribbean has begun. We saw inklings of this with the extrajudicial execution campaign in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific. But the action on January 2nd, the kidnapping of President Nicolás Maduro, the flagrant violation of Venezuelan sovereignty, should be understood as a threat not just to Venezuela and not just to the countries that are aligned with it, but the entire region. And I think because, frankly, we're seeing a situation that I've called the strategic retreat of the United States back into its traditional spheres of influence. And one of them that it considers as its backyard, an odious term, but nonetheless the one that many policymakers use, is Latin America. And they want to exert not just control, not just arrangements, not just pliant governments, but total domination through force. In fact, at this conference, we heard someone talk about how, when someone retreats in boxing, how do they do it? They do it with violence. They do it by punching. And that's what we're witnessing right now and why we need a regional response. In fact, I think the lack of a more forceful regional response to some of the other actions that the Trump administration had been doing in the region is the reason we're at this point now. So this is really a watershed moment. We have to get our act together. We have to figure out how to have a united response and to also have a mobilization that transcends borders, where we have the populations and progressive governments where they do exist, but above all, the working class, the organized peoples of our continent responding to the threat that the United States poses right now.
I mean, I couldn't have said any better. The Americans, just the extrajudicial killing of Qasem Soleimani, there's not much repercussion that was paid back for this brutal violation of Syrian sovereignty. And now we see what's happening in Venezuela. But more, right now in Iran, there's talks that the United States might strike Iran in support of the so-called protesters in Iran, and the lack of forceful response to Venezuela is giving America the carte blanche to do whatever it wants around the world. There are delegates from many countries, right? I believe I saw Venezuela, Cuba. What's the sentiment among the delegates at this conference?
The sentiment is the need for us to really articulate that continental vision about an understanding that there really is a turning point for the region, that there has to be a more forceful response. To pick up on what you were saying in your question, these attacks against Venezuela, the attacks against Cuba, Nicaragua, against Iran, I think follow a certain pattern, which is that the US understands that states that are governed by counter-hegemonic, anti-imperialist regimes are very much a threat, because it's the threat of the example. It's countries that refuse to bow before the United States and that have been very vehement in their denunciations of imperialism. And that inspires people throughout the region. In that room, we were discussing around the heroic efforts of the Cuban people to resist a decades-long campaign. And the people of Iran, the government in Iran, very much fits along those lines as well. And of course, we can't forget the very special relationship that Iran and Venezuela had in terms of sharing knowledge of resistance, how to evade these illegal unilateral coercive measures that the United States imposes on countries like Iran and Venezuela. And so I think that also was an element that even policymakers, people like Marco Rubio themselves said, this country, Maduro, was allowing Iranians in, or the presence of Hamas and Hezbollah and all of these kinds of accusations. And even if Venezuela was friendly towards resistance movements, that is its sovereign decision. That is not for the United States to say they can or cannot do. But the fact that they point to it shows that they understand that these global organizations, these linkages that exist between resistance movements and governments that are anti-imperialist are important, and why it's important for us to also understand that we shouldn't fall into this trap of condemning this or that group, of saying, well, I don't align with them ideologically perfectly. The governments that are in the process of actually facing a very real violent threat by US imperialism, they understand it. And they understand it because they're in that position of actually having to resolve these contradictions that are being imposed on them by US imperialism. And so I think that's also an important lesson for all of us here as we're discussing this, to understand that we really have to get past the sectarianism. We may have differences with each other. We may have had sharp disagreements around this or that issue in the region. But right now, the threat is so overwhelming that we have to move past it.
I was walking across the streets of Bogotá just before this conference. I see graffitis all over the place of La Patria Grande. Petro has tweeted in support of Gran Colombia, the unity of Panama, Colombia, Venezuela, saying that this is a necessary response to the violation of Venezuelan sovereignty. Obviously, Gran Colombia goes beyond also these three countries. But I'm wondering, are people in this conference right now talking about Gran Colombia? Is there a sense of urgency that the only way to resist is through unity?
Overwhelmingly, the message is that the way to successfully resist, because the resistance, whether or not we are temporarily defeated or not, will always persist. And I'm of the belief that we actually should be pretty optimistic, especially in the case of Latin America. This is a dark period, but we've gone through even darker moments, like the dictatorships of the Southern Cone, the counterinsurgency campaigns in Central America, the dirty war in Mexico, and the left endured. So, of course, we will continue to resist no matter what happens in the coming weeks, months, years even. We have to remember Donald Trump is barely 1 year in. He still has 3 years left, and maybe more if he gets what he wants by staying longer in power. And so there has to be also this understanding of, yes, we must defend the sovereignty of its individual nation state here in the region. It's something that is sacrosanct here in Latin America. It's something that is a product of revolutionary struggle, of independence struggles, to really secure that. But that doesn't mean that these borders are permanent fixtures, that we can't have articulation and unity across those borders between social movements, between governments, between trade unions, whatever it is, this understanding that by being able to better articulate, to coordinate actions, and sharing strategies, I think are also important in terms of how we can kind of break down those barriers that maybe have been built up because of rivalries between countries, in order to really understand again, the stakes of this situation, of really understanding that this moment requires us to be far more oriented towards the future in terms of what could happen and what does that mean in terms of actually challenging kind of all of these previous assumptions about how we conduct policy or how we conduct politics in the international realm. And I say that because as much as we've heard, for example, Prime Minister Mark Carney finally admit what we all knew was true, is that there was no such thing as the rules-based order. But the fact that we are now cognizant of it, aware of it, should tell us that that means our strategies, our tactics have to also adapt. And like I said, that does mean trying to figure out how we can build greater unity that actually can survive the coming attack that's going to come from US imperialism.
Right after the kidnapping of Maduro, the United States started sending accusations against Cuba, that Cuba might be next and that Diaz-Canel should be scared. That came from Marco Rubio and Trump himself. There are delegates of the Cuban government here at this conference. How's the sentiment related to, existential threats from the Americans towards Cuba? Venezuelan ships seem to be being intercepted when they're on their way to Cuba to deliver much needed oil and gas. I believe there's some talks that Mexico is going to be increasing the amount of gas being shipped to Cuba. Are we thinking about a way of protecting Latin America from future attacks, or are we thinking about ways to defend Cuba at the moment? Where's the urgency at this conference?
So when you see that Cuba is mentioned right after they attacked and kidnapped the president of Venezuela, well, it tells you how clearly Cuba is also that threat to US hegemony in the region. And that's why they seem to be next in the firing line. And that very much is present here. Around the issue of oil, we have to understand that it's not just about having access to energy resources, it's about the humanitarian impact that a blockade of oil would have on Cuba. It would be devastating. And it's not just about having gasoline at the gasoline stations or plain aviation fuel. It's about having diesel to run hospitals. It's about having people have electricity for at least a few hours a day. People don't really seem to actually appreciate what it means. And absolutely, Mexico has stepped up to the plate and has started shipping more. And if you look at the numbers, it's really clear as day that absolutely, Mexico is filling in that gap that has been left as a result of the US infringing on Venezuela's right to sell or give away oil to its allies like they did previously in the case of Cuba. But that is also a major issue because just this week, Politico reported that the US is considering a total blockade of oil to Cuba. And the only thing that appears to be holding them back is precisely their fear of an even greater humanitarian catastrophe in Cuba. And that would actually not necessarily serve US foreign policy goals in this moment. But it is a means that the United States is using to pressure the Sheinbaum government in Mexico, trying to make it part of the USMCA revision that is happening this year in 2026. But of course, that is also a violation of sovereignty. Mexico has the right to engage in commercial trade with whoever it wants. The United States can't do that, even if they want to try to do it through this trade agreement. And so, in that sense, it's also important for the people of Mexico to send a message to the Sheinbaum government that we defend our sovereign right to sell oil to Cuba and that we won't accept a trade-off to sacrifice the Cuban people in order to kind of save graces with the United States. That is not a position that the Mexican people will accept. And Sheinbaum, who has taken the correct position, who has defended Mexico's right to distribute oil and provide oil as a humanitarian aid to Cuba, that she understands that there is support from the population for her to take a hardline position in these negotiations. It's always this delicate balance of, yes, of having to deal with the United States, which is the number one trading partner of Mexico, while also understanding that there is a sentiment here that it's important for us to stand by our allies like Cuba.
This event seems to be backed by the Colombian government. At least, it's being hosted at the Foreign Affairs Ministry, the old house of Simón Bolívar. There's elections coming up this year in Colombia. Cepeda, the successor of Gustavo Petro, President Gustavo Petro, seems to be likely to win the elections. How critical do you think the elections in Colombia will be for such a response to American threats in Latin America? Gustavo Petro is probably one of the, it's the only leftist president in Colombian history, at least modern history. Yeah.
In the case of Colombia, as we know, in the past, it was largely governed by not just right-wing, but radical right-wing governments. People like Uribe, who is guilty of so many crimes, but hasn't been persecuted, unfortunately. And the election of Petro was monumental for this country. The first left-wing government here, perhaps ever. And if there in the next election here in Colombia, the left does not succeed in continuing that project, it would be a huge blow to the balance of forces, of progressive forces in Latin America. It's hard to overstate how much of an impact that could have, because Colombia has always been viewed by the United States as a bastion, as a place where it could always kind of do as it wished and put its bases wherever it wanted. And in fact, had it not been for Petro, it's quite likely that the invasion of Venezuela would have included an element that coming in from the Colombian-Venezuelan border. So it's really important, but also in terms of the balance of forces in the entire region, going from El Rio Bravo all the way down to the Patagonia south. Because unfortunately, we've also seen the triumph, due to US interference in several cases, of the right wing in this region. And so there's only a few left, and we have to maintain those. Fortunately, as of today, Iván Cepeda, who, as you well said, is the candidate for the ruling party here, the ruling coalition, looks well poised. He can't fall into the triumphalism of thinking it's all going to be done, because the US interference is coming. One way or another, they're going to interfere in this process to try to tip the scales in favor of the right here. We saw it in Argentina. We saw it really blatantly in Honduras, where it actually changed the result due to the late intervention by Donald Trump, where he endorsed the right-wing candidate. So we know that that's coming, and I think that's important for us because, often we talk about civil political rights. That's a massive violation of the civil rights of the Colombian people to freely decide their own government. And we have to be ready to also denounce that. How far those denunciations will actually go when it comes to impacting US policy, well, that's yet to be seen. But we have to be aware of what's coming so that we can be ready when it does, and also defend the will of the people here in Colombia, which looks to be poised to continue this process that was begun with Petro through the election of Iván Cepeda.
Juan, this is the second time you appear on Reason to Resist. The first time we did a report on the 36th year anniversary of the brutal U.S. invasion of Panama.
Yeah.
That just happened to be around 10 days, 2 weeks, 14 days before the U.S. invasion of Venezuela. The terrible kidnapping and breach of sovereignty of Venezuela, the kidnapping of President Nicolas Maduro. Why do you think it's important for you, as a member of the revolutionary youth of Panama, to come to Colombia and be part of a conference such as Nuestra America?
Well, right now the global situation and our regional situation specifically is very dire. The United States has taken its mask off. They are no longer playing democracy. They are no longer playing the nice neighbor, as they said. They were never the nice neighbor, but they like to pretend they were. But now they are going to brutally repress any government, any movement, any peoples that don't want US hegemony to interfere on their internal affairs. So Panama right now specifically, we are being treated as a colony. Last year, the United States government said, yeah, Panama is like our fifth border. They are our backyard, and we're very glad to have the cooperation of their president. And also, every other day, they say that President Trump of the United States says, yeah, we're still thinking about retaking the canal. And aside from that, they have already deployed military troops to Panama, which is illegal by our constitution. They are building military bases in our country, which is also illegal. They are interfering in our internal affairs, moving our government towards doing unpopular decisions that have our people on the streets fighting, but also persecuted politically. And we have people that are exiled, people that are in jail, people that have been tortured. We have people that have been disappeared only in the last year. And the recent aggression on Venezuela only makes us more certain that we need international solidarity, we need coordination in our whole region, our whole hemisphere, and the entire world to face US hegemony and their war-led imperialism. Yeah.
And I mean, previously, right on our report on the 20th of December, you properly warned Latin Americans, our audience, of the danger of US invasion and what we could learn from Panama for the case of Venezuela. But the thing is that right after invading Venezuela, Trump reiterated threats against Cuba. It seems like we need a strong response in order to ensure that the dominoes don't keep on falling, and that we need to build an alliance, a coalition to resist American hegemony. I believe there was recent elections in Chile, which turned out to be awful. The government of Argentina is awful. There's elections in Colombia coming up, which it looks like things are going to plan out somewhat well.
Yeah.
But I mean, as part of this conference, what kind of reaction are you looking to see from Latin Americans?
Well, in this conference specifically, which had delegates from the Colombian government, different Colombian grassroots movements, syndicates, agrarian popular movements, and from around the entire world, we have seen a commitment to solidarity with Cuba, with Mexico, and with Colombia as well, because the United States is threatening all of our sovereignty, all of our right to decide how we want to govern our own countries and with whom we want to have commerce with. And in this conference, we have talked about strategies to support Cuba, both materially and also politically and in a cultural sense. We need to have mass media campaigns against the dominant US narrative that Cuba is an awful dictatorship that only cares about robbing its people, while they don't mention the more than 60 years of genocidal blockade against their people. So we are committing to having a solidarity movement, a solidarity compromise to support Cuba. Some governments here have talked about maintaining the petroleum and oil shipments to Cuba, even if the US threatens them.
Cuba came to the defense of Venezuela. I believe it was 32 Cuban martyrs that stood until the very end fighting, and I mean, it cost them their lives, to the defense of Latin America, to the defense of Cuba themselves, through Venezuela, and the defense of Venezuela itself as well. Beyond media, are there concrete military actions that should be taken, an international brigade, to come to the defense of Latin America, in a sense where United States are not scared of using weapons. They've used weapons that apparently have been never used before in the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro and the killing of countless Venezuelans. Is there a need for military defense or a unified brigade to come to the defense of Latin America?
Yes, so in this meeting we have also talked about the importance of military, economic, political, and strategic cooperation between the progressive and leftist countries of Latin America. Some people talked about internationalist brigades, referring to the old times of 1930s when there was the Spanish Civil War, and people from all around the world went there to combat fascism. Right now, we are at the helm of another anti-fascist war, and we have to prepare ourselves to send internationalist brigades to the countries that need our aid, Cuba included. The Cuban representative in Colombia also talked about their people being ready to put their entire lives on the line to defend their island. They are a very proud, intelligent, and patriotic people. They have been waging a protracted war against the United States while not having the upper hand. And they still keep on their dignity, they still keep on the fight, and they have the backing of the progressive and leftist movements of Latin America, and we will be there to defend them when the time comes.
I believe your group is the only representative of Panama at
Yes.
this conference. What does it mean what did your group learn from the Nuestra America conference? And do you think is a contribution that your group was able to bring to make this conference successful?
So our group has learned a lot about international articulation. We are a relatively new group. We have 5 years of existence in Panama. And right here we have made lots of contacts with syndicates, leftist parties, communists, revolutionaries, and people from all around the world committed to the fight. They have told me about strategies they had used to, by one part, wage the ideological war, but on the other hand, how to organize politically and in a militant way. So we have had a really good participation. We have also made successful the conference by simply being here, because being the only representative of Panama means that at the very least one voice of our country has been heard, and one voice of our country has made the connections with comrades from all around the world in the times we need the most togetherness and the most unity against the US empire.
And I think this is what Trump is trying to do: fragment Latin America, isolate trade, and stop Latin Americans from industrializing themselves. How do you evaluate right now? I mean, Latin America seems to be, as much as it's united as you've mentioned, there's also a bit of division when we look at Chile and Argentina. Is this conference also looking at liberating in some way the other parts of Latin America that seems to be occupied, right? As I said, Chile and Argentina.
Mm-hmm. Right now we have talked about South-South cooperation, Latin American integration, and also social movements and popular movements coming together to fight against imperialism in all ways possible. This has, at the most, it has been a very diplomatic way of setting our international strategy, but there have also been some voices that talk about the militancy, about power and class struggle as the main basis of our way to lead the United States out of our countries. In Ecuador, Bolivia, Argentina, Chile, these are all countries that are right now being held hostage by the United States and the right-wing governments that govern them, as well as Panama and Costa Rica and Honduras right now, that has the left lost the election because of US interference, and El Salvador with Bukele. We have seen this wave of right-wing presidents and Congress being taken by storm because the United States need them to be their representatives, but not their representatives, their vassals. And they need the job done. The job is to protect US imperialism. And they may take a little bit of the dividends that will come from protecting the US empire. And we, the popular movements, will not let them take this as an easy victory, and we will not let them win in the long term.
And last time we met was in Panama City. Today we're in Bogotá. Not that long ago, at least in the 1917s, if I'm not mistaken, Colombia and Panama was one country. Maybe I had the year
1903.
1903,
Yeah.
Just a few years off.
Yeah.
Petro has tweeted in support of Gran Colombia as a form of natural defense pact without impeding on the, let's just say, local sovereignty
of course,
of Panamanians, Venezuelans, Colombians,
and Ecuadorians.
How do you kind of envision, I mean, first of all, what is your position on Gran Colombia, and how do you envision it to happen, or do you see any value in terms of national security?
Yes. First of all, I support the concept of a Grand Colombia from a confederative perspective, which is how Petro has mentioned it to go. If it ever comes along in this century, I hope it does, because the fact is the Grand Colombia was divided by European powers and the United States to keep us weakened and not be a regional power that could stand for itself. So I genuinely see a positive gain from uniting ourselves again without breaking our sovereignty, but having a planned cooperation, territorial and political program. We need to defend ourselves, and the Confederation of the Sahel is an example of this working perfectly fine. We need to follow that example, and it is being done, and it can be done. So my sincerest desire is for this to happen. Sadly, most of the Panamanian people have been taken by the reactionary postures of our oligarchy, so they oppose any concept of Gran Colombia. They think Colombia wants to colonize us or Colombia is imperialist, and it has nothing to do with that. It's a mutual defense, a mutual cooperation, a mutual development project that we really need in this century that is leading up to be very violent and to be shaped by resistance and alliances between the global South peoples.
It's absurd to talk about Colombia as a colonial project in Panama, specifically when it comes in contradiction to the US invasion of Panama of 1989.
Yeah.
But on a slightly different note, Venezuela is a Bolivarian socialist republic. It was invaded, and we must protect Venezuela at all costs. But right now there are protests in Iran. A lot of it is funded by the Americans and the Zionists. And we're seeing, I mean, maybe not as much here in Colombia and Latin America, but in Europe, in the West, in Canada, North America, United States, lots of people are falling into the trap of supporting these dissidents in Iran, although they're not as numerous as we think they are, but they're overly represented in the diaspora. And in many ways, it seems like they're repeating Zionist propaganda, and in some ways, legitimizing intervention and bombing. Again, your country went through an invasion in 1989.
Yes.
And you warned us about Venezuela. What can you tell us about Iran?
Iran is the same old playbook of sanctioning a country, having a strangle on their economy, on their productive forces, and not letting them develop a national industry all on their own. And Iran has fared well for the situation they have been put in, but still, irregularities and some mistakes can lead to critical situations within the country. And right now we are seeing a legitimate economic difficulty upon the Iranian people, but it is because of the United States sanctions, the same strategy they use in Cuba, they use in Venezuela, they use in North Korea, they used in Syria, they used in every country they don't like because they said no. So Iran right now is falling into the same trap of being liberated, when all that will mean is that they will be governed by a Zionist fascistic dictatorship that will murder anyone that wants a sovereign project. They will be way, way, way far worse than they are now with the Iranian government, and people don't understand that. Panama went from a dictatorship to a neoliberalist hellscape, and they have been, in the last 30 years, selling off all of our national industries and our national sectors of the economy to multinationals because they liberated us. That's the same they do in every country they bomb, they invade, and they sanction. So the revolutionary protesters of Iran are not revolutionary. There certainly are people upset and actually protesting the economic situation, but the agitators that are wielding Zionist weapons and shooting people from both the crowds and the police and security forces, they are Zionists. Mossad agents sent in to destabilize Iran right in the moment that Israel was saying we need to bomb Iran, and the United States also says we're coming after them after we deal with Syria, and they already dealt with Syria. Right now, Rojava felt, and people were cheering off the fall of Assad, and now they are led by an Al Qaeda.
At least 3,000 ISIS prisoners.
Yeah, they released 3,000 ISIS prisoners. They're tearing down statues of women soldiers of the Syrian Defense Forces that were the Kurdish. So I don't know in which way people still keep on thinking that Western liberation is actually liberation. It's only invasion, pillaging, and subjugation.
And what I have trouble understanding as someone who grew up in the West, lived my entire life in the West, is that we are in support of revolutions all over the world at all costs, at the cost of destruction, deindustrialization. But what I'll never understand is if this applies to Syria and Iran, why doesn't it apply to us ourselves at home? Why don't we have a revolution in Canada first? It's close to home. I could do something about it. And when it comes to Iran, we can't do much. So this is just my little thought, is that, this is a conference of people in the global South. The global South is standing up. Can the global North do its share of standing up to ourselves? Because we're the ones that are committing the crimes. And why are we expecting the South to liberate themselves? They should. But we should also put the roadblocks to crack down on those weapons that are being sent to bomb my siblings in Palestine that supported the invasion of Panama, of Venezuela, possibly Cuba and Colombia, Iran, Syria, the list goes on. It seems like now there's less countries that were not invaded than countries that were invaded.
Yeah.
And that's just absurd.
It is. So yeah, as a final reflection, I can only say that the United States has been and always will be the same empire until it stops being a capitalist country. Capitalist runs to its very core, to its very foundation, to its political system, to its culture, and to every single action that country does is led by capitalism. So the struggle is also a class struggle. It is not also, it is mainly a class struggle. And we need to be reminded of that. The capitalist class, wants to subjugate the entire global South. In this moment, the hegemonic capitalist United States empire is crumbling. They are trying to piece it back together by violence, mass violence if need be. And we cannot let that happen. We cannot let them reconstruct their capitalist empire. We need to tear it down to pieces and rebuild this society from the ashes of the old one. We need to dream of a new, human and dignified society where we can truly live in a world where many worlds are accepted, as the Zapatistas say, in a world where we build based on true shared values, true kinship, and really deep love of our comrades, as also Che Guevara used to say. A true revolutionary is led by a deep and profound sense of love. So we need to be reminded that we need to keep on the fight, keep on the struggle, keep organizing, keep agitating, and keep on mobilizing. Hasta la victoria siempre, venceremos.
Venceremos.
Today is the final day of the Nuestra America conference. During the conference, there was a lot of mentions of Palestine. Why do you think the ties between Venezuela, Latin America, Colombia, and Palestine is so important?
First of all, we understand that it's all connected. It's the same system that exploits, oppresses, and destroys nature all around the world and promotes genocides in Palestine, in Congo, in Sudan, ecocides in the Amazon, and all the other biomes of the world. So being everything connected, we need to have a common strategy as well. Second, we understand that the imperialism and Zionism, the most horrific ideologies of the generation that needs to be defeated, they treated Gaza as an experimentation camp. Something that they validated in Gaza and seeing managed to do that with almost total impunity. Now they are reproducing in many other places. So it's very dangerous for everybody. So we understand that the resistance needs to be together with all the multiplicity of tactics that we may have, and solidarity needs to be together as well. Because part of the project of imperialism and Zionism is not only to impose by the use of force, but also to create ideological traps so that people will divide themselves, will separate themselves, and we need to counter this process. We need to make sure that people understand that we are all together. The 99% of people that does not benefit from the system is directly impacted by what is happening in Gaza right now, but what is happening in Venezuela, what is happening in Iran, and everywhere else where imperialism has their aims to put their claws. So we need to be together in this. We need to mobilize. We need to make sure that we learn from the strategies that they use. We have our own strategies as well to counter that. That's what we'll be doing here, and I believe it's an important step.
I've heard you promote possibly a Latin American or a Caribbean flotilla to Palestine. Can you tell us more information about that?
We have two different processes here. In Latin America, there's a lot of people willing to build a flotilla to show that the seas here need to be a zone of peace, needs to be an area where imperialism does not rule. So there are many different initiatives coming out of people saying that we need to have flotillas because Cuba has been under blockade since the Cuban Revolution in 1959. Venezuela has been under severe blockade right now. They're threatening Colombia, they're threatening Mexico, they're still occupying Puerto Rico and so many places. So the idea of having boats, solidarity boats, sailing here is also very important. Another thing is the mission to break the siege of Gaza, where we try to send boats from everywhere else around the world. If we're gonna have from Latin America going to Gaza, we don't know it yet, but we're definitely gonna have a very strong delegation from Latin America to show that the Palestinian people are not alone and that the destiny of the Palestinian people is most likely the destiny of all humanity right now.
I think sharing the similarities between the blockade of Cuba and the embargo, the blockade on Gaza, I think it's extremely important. Now, the threat of Zionism is not, as you mentioned, it's not just in Palestine or in the Middle East, but at the moment there are wildfires in the Patagonia region. It seems like Israeli quote-unquote tourists seem to be, in many cases, responsible for these wildfires. And President Milei, who happens to be a strong supporter of Israel's Zionism and Netanyahu, seems to be looking to privatize the Patagonia forest, which is essential to the Patagonia region, which is essential to Latin American biodiversity. Yes. Can you tell us more about what's going on in Patagonia?
Yes. First of all, it's important to understand that Zionism is not about religion. It's about ideological domination of supremacism and racism that affects the Palestinian people, but also affects Latin American people as well. Let us remember that the founding book of Zionism is called The Jewish State, from Theodor Herzl from 1895. On this book, when he writes that he wanted to build a nation state for the Jewish people, he says that it could either happen in Palestine. He mentions another place in the Argentinian Patagonia. After that, the Zionist Congress developed the theory that they should focus on Palestine because of the historical reasons, because of an energy sector of oil and the strategic geopolitical place. But they were always had the Argentinian Patagonia in their crosshairs for their colonial project. And now that they see the Zionist project in Palestine facing so many problems, a problem of legitimacy that will never recover from the lack of public trust, the consequences of promoting and perpetrating a genocide. So they're thinking about other options. So there's a huge migration of Zionists going to Cyprus. There's a huge migration of Zionists going to Argentina and Patagonia. And their methods to conquer their lands are pretty much the same. They try to evict people. They try to take over by force, by other use of crimes, like putting things on fire. They also have a lot of economic power. So they buy land and then they expel the indigenous people and the local people from these places, just like it happened from Palestine until this colonial project gained the strength of a state within a state by the partition plan of the United Nations. So the whole world is at stake right now. Not only the places where they are trying to occupy and settle, and they're never peaceful and never integrating settlement into societies. It's always segregationists, racists, and supremacists like Zionists are. but also all the other countries that they destabilize, that they overthrow governments, that they promote a lot of violence, that are also in their crosshairs.
And we saw it with the workflow of President Maduro in Venezuela. It benefits, of course, Zionism, Netanyahu, the Israeli project. I have a question to you as a Brazilian. There has been a lot of concerns about Lula's response to Maduro, to Venezuela. Primarily, I believe Lula had vetoed Venezuela's participation into BRICS. Of course, ultimately, the responsibility of the kidnapping of President Maduro is in the United States. But do you think that we can expect more from Brazil in terms of solidarity with our neighbors? Lula is a progressive, supposedly a progressive. How can we not stand much stronger with Maduro?
That is something very important for us to discuss about Brazil. The country where I'm from, we live under a big contradiction. We are a huge continental country, which has the biggest river, the biggest tropical forests, has the biggest reserves of potable water in liquid form. We have so much biodiversity. We have so much strength in our country that could be a huge superpower in the world. But the colonial process and submission to imperial designs for our country keep standing in the way, despite the fact that we have some popular governments from time to time. And Lula is a popular government that in general does not serve imperialist projects, that it's considered an obstacle by them and an enemy by them. But sometimes his conciliation way find ways not to be in solidarity with people that need solidarity, but also to abide by some demands from imperial demands that comes from Washington and Tel Aviv, that should not be abiding, that the Brazilian people in general do not support. So we've seen that with Venezuela. Brazil has always been a historical ally of Venezuela, and Latin American integration was decisive to defeat the free trade agreement of the Americas, was decisive to bring UNASUR, to bring Mercosur and other regional projects as well. But on Lula's last term, Lula understands that the correlation of forces is weaker in Brazil, that he needs to give more to the liberal right in order to maintain governance in Brazil. And that is a mistake. And that made Brazil do serious mistakes in foreign policy, including, first of all, questioning Venezuela's election, despite the fact that he didn't question Ecuador's election, where it was clear that Noboa frauded that election. He didn't question Honduras' election, where it was clear there was interference there. He didn't ask for the reports of these elections, and he started asking for the reports of Venezuelan elections. And despite that, even worse, at the BRICS meeting in Gaza, Brazil was very decisive from the Brazilian Foreign Ministry to block Venezuela to enter BRICS, which weakened Venezuela, but also weakened Latin America as a whole. And that was a serious mistake that the Brazilian people in general do not support and that we need to pressure. There's a Brazilian priest that says, dealing with government, if either an ally or an opposing government, is like cooking beans. It needs to be under pressure. And we need to pressure any government, including our own from Lula.
And keep in mind that Lula was under the same treatment that Maduro has gone through. He was impeached under these bogus claims of this car wash, apartment, God knows what. He should know better.
And Venezuela was the first country to offer oxygen for the Brazilian people during COVID. When people in Manaus, in the Amazon, was dying without oxygen, Venezuela was so generous and brought a huge cargo of oxygen to save Brazilian people. And Brazilians didn't respond to that, the same generosity.
And just one last question. In the spirit of Nuestra America, I believe there's a strong campesino movement in Brazil called the MST, Movimento Sem Terra. Can you share us some more information about this land reclamation movement in Brazil?
Yes, in Brazil, we had a process in the 80s where it was very strong. The campesino movement demanding land reform, a lot of movements in the cities as well, even connected to theology of liberation, to the Catholic Progressive Church. We had a lot of union struggles with major strikes that created the United Central Workers in Brazil. We also had the Workers' Party. That was the process of their creation. The creation of the MST, the landless movement, ended up with the creation of the biggest movement in Latin America, which is something very, very important. We are still with a task that still needs to be completed. Land reform is far from happening in Brazil. Actually, land is getting more and more concentrated. Agribusiness taking over not only the public share of investments, but also taking over public opinion and going everywhere in society saying that they sustain the country's economy and they're the backbone of economy, that is not true at all. The familiar agriculture is the basis of our food sovereignty in Brazil, and we need to invest in that. So the landless movement is a very strategic movement that we hope for the best. We are clear supporters of this movement, but we still have a long way to go on land reform.
Hello, Simon from Centro Pensamento Vida.
There you go.
This is the Nuestra America conference. How much of this conference was supported or set up by the Colombian government?
So there was a very direct relationship between Progressive International and the Colombian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to organize this conference. As you know, we are sitting right now in the Palace of the Chancellery of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I would say that Progressive International plays a key role in helping the Colombian government liaise with progressive forces in the entire continent. Particularly of particular importance in this conference was the relation with the United States, with American politicians and progressive-minded people like Bill de Blasio, like the Democratic Socialists of America, who came here to this country to support what we're living through about this new onset, this new form of imperialism in Colombia and in the entire region.
So we're just really the end of this conference. Can you tell us more about the conclusion? What were the outcomes of this conference?
Okay, I would say that in terms of the outcomes, there is a will to organize from the point of view of progressive forces, not only of the states themselves, but of progressive forces, to liaise and to ally with each other, to face a common ground, to have a common ground to face this new imperialist aggression. And I believe in that regard, this conference was successful in bringing the voices together and establishing a common program of action that is in the declaration. Something I would like to say as well is that it's very important for us in Latin America and towards the entire world to understand that the forces behind US imperialism today are not merely Donald Trump's personality, they are not merely the rise of fascism as a political movement, but rather behind those forces there is a massive economic drive of resource acquisition, of imperialism in terms of economic imperialism of the American capitalist class and of its digital capitalist class, thinking about Elon Musk, who threatened our president saying plata o plomo, threatening Gustavo Petro as if he was Pablo Escobar. And in that regard, we believe there is some strong forces behind this, who, as neoliberalism failed, and it failed for the United States, losing, in our opinion, the economic competition with China as a rising power. What that means is that they are trying to ensure that they have a strategic retreat zone to go to, and that's, for them, our continent. We need to be repellent to that. We need to create this strategic autonomy in a multipolar world, and Latin America needs to have a place in the table, not as individual countries that can be easily picked off by US imperialism, but rather as an entire region that is able to withstand and to have a common ground against this movement.
And basically, this conference, as you mentioned, had strong support from the Colombian government. There's elections coming up. What do you think? Do you think there's a continuity for the Nuestra America project in the near future, considering the status of Colombia, which could change at the elections?
We strongly believe that Colombia is a key country in the building of Nuestra America, of the Patria Grande, and we strongly believe that because Colombia used to be the Israel of Latin America, it used to be the bulwark of US imperialism in our continent. In that regard, us having changed that, and the political process in Colombia being as strong as it is, we believe there is a strong chance for the progressive forces in Colombia to get re-elected in the name of Iván Cepeda, our candidate. And in that sense, we believe that there is a very strong push, even the fact that US imperialism is attacking our president, they're coming for us, that is able to generate a patriotic movement in the country of Colombia not being a colony of any country, but rather being a free and sovereign country in a free and sovereign Latin America.
You've mentioned, you said it from your own words, Colombia used to be the Israel of Latin America. How did that change?
There is a long-term process, and we believe that the class struggle in this country in the last 20 years has been warming up to the point where there was the critical mass high enough, and the collapse of the neoliberal consensus was so evident for the people that it allowed for that process to change. We believe the Colombian peace process with FARC had a key role in that, in demobilizing the question of politics as merely a question of political conflict, of armed conflict, but rather putting the forefront of class struggle not as an armed conflict lasting 60 years, which at the end ended up being very degraded, but rather allowing for democratic and mobilization routes that were able to allow the class struggle to burst towards the center of the arena and being the central issue that allowed this government to be elected. And we believe as well that the economic program of this government in terms of raising minimum wages, in terms of being able to alter the distribution of income from the rich towards the Colombian people, is able and has been able and is being able in this election to allow the issue of class struggle to come at the forefront of the election. And we believe that's why there's a reason we can win.
You've mentioned the increase in minimum wage. I believe it was 23% starting the first week of January 2026. Can you tell us more about how did Colombians benefit out of Petro's term as president?
The political program of Gustavo Petro, the election manifesto, which was elected, I believe, was elected on two premises. First, correcting the most horrible inequalities in this country, but B, also beginning a process of strategic long-term economic transformation, of transitioning from an extractive, rentist economy towards a productive economy. In that sense, I believe that in those two specific regards of an economic program, this government has been effective. The rise in the minimum wage, the labor reform, which also changed some key elements in labor law in the benefit of workers, is something that is very strategic for this country. And for the first time in decades, the Colombian working class, the Colombian people, have received concrete economic benefits from the policies of a government. This government demonstrated that the state can work for the people. And we believe that's why President Petro is finishing his term very high in the polls. He's finishing his term even higher than we expected. And that was even a possibility at the middle of the term. We believe we are ending in a high note. And the reason why is because we've been able to fulfill the promises we made. And the Colombian people are seeing that, and that's why we're very happy, and we see this election with great expectation.
And you could see it with Ivan Cepeda's popularity in the polls, which seems to be leading at the moment. And on a slightly different note, you mentioned China winning the economic battle against America and America needing to retreat to its hemisphere. That's the Monroe Doctrine, which is now being coined as the Dunroe Doctrine.
Yes.
China seems to be offering many of its products in Colombia that we do not have in Canada. I see multiple Chinese vehicles being sold here, BYD, Zeekr, among others. There's a flood of Chinese products into the Colombian economy. Can you tell me more about how did Chinese relations with Colombia evolve over time as it is right now under Petro, and how will Chinese relations with Colombia be impacted by the Dunroe Doctrine?
We believe that China can be a very strategic partner in economic development for Latin America and for Colombia in particular. That being said, we also don't believe that Beijing is going to save us. We don't believe that we are witnessing this sort of situation. We believe the Chinese can be and are strategic partners for this country, and we wish to build autonomous strategic relations, diplomatic and economic relations with the entire world. The program for Latin America cannot be a campus program of choosing between sides, but rather building a strategic autonomy to have relations with the entire world. And in that sense, I believe that the Chinese relations in this country, even during President Petro's administration, have evolved in that sense of building strategic partnerships with autonomy. We believe there's also a need to work with our Chinese partners to correct the very strong, commercial imbalance. The Chinese market can be a very interesting market for the Colombian producers, for the Colombian economy, and in that sense, we wish to deepen those relationships to have a strategic relation, not just in terms of infrastructure, but also commercially.
And finally, Donald Trump has put, you mentioned Elon Musk's Plato Plomo quote. which is a death threat in
Yes, literally a death threat from the richest man in the world. It's not a death threat to Petro, it's a death threat to the Colombian people and to the Latin American people.
to the sovereignty of Colombia. And these threats, I mean, have been materialized in Venezuela. What is Colombia's response to these death threats to the country?
Popular mobilizations in the country since Trump's and Musk's threats have been very strong. The Colombian people are developing a very strong sense of nationalism, of patriotism, and we believe that that movement, that building of that sentiment and feeling in the Colombian people is something that's very important, it's something that is building. We are no longer the Israel of Latin America, and we believe that this movement cannot be stopped. The Colombian people have learned with this government what it means to have dignity in international relations. Before, if you saw, for example, UN resolutions, UN General Assembly resolutions condemning Israel's genocide and condemning Israel's occupation of Palestine. Before it used to be US, Israel and Colombia voting against and 191 countries voting in favor. Now that has changed. And we believe that this strategic move in Colombia's diplomatic relations is something very important. And President Petro's leadership, even in the Arab world, for instance, of supporting Palestinians with such a strong and principled voice, is something that is going to allow us to build stronger bridges with the entire world and with the peoples of the world.
And you see it all over Bogotá with the graffiti saying Petro's not alone.
Yes, and we think the Colombian people are with the government, are with this political movement, and that's why we're moving forward.